So welcome. Thank you for taking the time. What we're going to do is talk about the how do you secure your cloud? How do you investigate incidents in Amazon? And how do you understand like even where you should start looking, and what are some of the tools that you can use? We'll go a little bit Lacework centric, but we'll also just tell you some of the tools and some of the data sources that are super important. So to get started, the cloud changes constantly by design. And actually, before I dive into this, I'd just love to introduce my friend here, Eugene. Aside from having like the coolest hair of anybody that I've had on a webinar this week, Eugene is, I think not only just a partner solution architect at Amazon, but also has a long experience as a developer and operations professional in fairly large scale environments on AWS. And he's got a few war stories. He's had some good things happen in his career and some tough things happen in the cloud. And so we'll talk about some of those. And I've enjoyed listening to some of his experiences. So, one of the things that we all experience is that the cloud is constantly changing. We have users and services and compute instances going up and down. We might have extra layers of complexity with Kubernetes, but there's a lot going on, and we need to be able to understand what's happening, and it can be hard to understand what's happening. And so when we look at this, generally a good way of starting to think about how to understand and start to think about how to secure this kind of environment. There's really sort of two halves of the environment to start looking at. The first is what I'll call the cloud layer, and this is a place where we're going to spend a fair amount of time today. But if you think about all the cloud services, all the configurations of those services, and Eugene, if you think about like how many APIs every service has, it's probably like 100 APIs per service at least.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right. And so like there's a lot going on there, and I think when when I watch people's heads explode when they get going with AWS, it's typically around IAM permissions and just like all of those APIs. And so of course, as a security professional or someone who's responsible for security, the kind of thing that I want to keep an eye on is what's happening inside my cloud environments, right? I want to know if new regions or services are turned on, if somebody's taken one of those permissions and used it for something else. If somebody's logging in and they're not using two-factor authentication, or they're changing the security group policies, and so those are the types of things that I might be concerned about at that cloud layer, and we'll spend some more time around talking specifically about this, as we're going to actually spend a fair amount of time.
Yeah.
And then the other side of this is the application processes, the network, the workloads, and containers, and what are they doing? And this, this is an area where, in many ways, this part of it isn't necessarily specific to any cloud. This could be the containers you run in your on-prem data center. This could be the containers that you run in the cloud. But thinking about how those containers and those applications interact with each other. You've got a whole nother set of APIs that you create for yourself. And so, in a large scale environment or any environment, we want to know what kind of behaviors are happening here. We want to know, like, is there a service talking to some external service that's on a shady IP address? Is there, is somebody logging into a server somewhere that's, that shouldn't be? Is there a process in an application that's not right? And so, understanding what's happening at that application layer is fairly different from understanding what's happening at that cloud layer. But you have to be able to do both. So, one of the things, and this will be kind of the guide for for where we're going to spend our time here. We think about how to manage that. The first thing that everyone wants to do is make sure you're configured properly, right? So you want to make sure that things are configured well, that you're meeting those configuration compliance requirements that you have via CIS or whatever other framework that you have to match to. And you have to do that at the host workload application layer as well as at the cloud layer. We'll talk about some options for that. Once you've configured things well, then the next thing is understanding all the changes and detecting breaches or threats or any sort of weird behaviors that are occurring in both of those layers. So once you've configured things well, then of course people are going to make changes. And then the third piece of that is how do you investigate and discover and remediate all those issues. So, one of our observations at Lacework is that, when you go investigate, when you go figure out what it is that you're going to do, one of the things to think about is how long does it take you to do this, right? You want to spend your time surfacing, who, what, when, why, and how of what happened. And today there's a lot of different steps that you can go through. And so we call this the mean time to WTF, which is, if you get an alert or you see something that's weird, how long does it take you to figure out whether or not that's a thing or not? And so Eugene, I'd love to, maybe if you have a mean time to WTF story, or maybe we'll hold those up for a little bit, but that's typically a thing that people struggle with.
Yeah, I mean, the ability to kind of reduce your investigation time is really important, especially if you have something, and in a story that I'll tell you all in a little bit. But time is kind of money, as cliche as it sounds. If you're a company that is delivering some type of value, or if as your company is delivering whatever type of value it is to your customers, your service being down, or something not working, latency going up, user data is not being secure properly, and so forth, you lose trust in your customers. And because the technology market, different type of companies are all kind of arising, different competitors coming up, you don't want to lose your hard-earned customers. And so I think in my situation, it was actually earlier this year before I joined Amazon. I was a software engineer in my last role, and I was on call. And typically, as many of you may know, being on call sometimes is great when nothing is happening, but when you're getting woken up at 4 a.m. with literally all the alerts kind of slamming in your face saying like, hey, this service is down, we're not able to reach this endpoint, latency is through the roof, you kind of wake up and wondering oh my gosh, what happened? And so I remember when I logged on and got into the conference call with all the other support engineers, usually you would think that there's maybe 4, 5, 6 other. There was about 50 support engineers on this call because it was a complete global issue. And I just remember looking at the service, it's hey, I don't see the actual application being spun up in the containers anymore. Wait a minute. And not only do we not have the containers running the applications, the cluster in production is completely deleted. And so, at my last company, we our service was to provide travel, for customers to buy, airplane tickets, to book hotels, and essentially, as we if our website isn't working, that means that no one can buy our product, which means that we're losing money. And so we spent, I mean, because again, the mean time to kind of figure out what's going on. Well, someone I finally posted hey, so our ECS clusters, our prod ECS cluster is completely gone. So we need to kind of have a rollback strategy. And so the next issue was well, was this intentional? Was this like malicious? Like, was this like a competitor like hacking into, I'm kidding, but it's like, was a competitor like hacking into like our account and like doing this stuff? And so that is kind of what we're trying to go after next, right? Because even if we do fix it, if we don't figure out like why this happened, then it's prone to happen again. But anyways,
Yeah.
want to kind of throw that back to you, Abner.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's like, that's just such a common story of, everybody's on a phone call or a Zoom and they're trying to figure out what's happening. And of course, that's tough. Um, uh, just really quick before we dive into this, just for those of you who don't know Lacework very well, we bring context to cloud in 4 big areas: configuration compliance, vulnerability discovery, cloud API and user activity, which we'll talk a lot more about, and then um, Kubernetes containers and host workload security. And we do that in a very cloudy way, and we'll, if you're interested, come and talk to us more about that. But let's dive into the first big thing around just reducing attack surfaces, and that's generally configs and vulnerabilities. And one of the really amazing things about being in the cloud is that cloud services are incredibly powerful. We talked about how cloud service might have 100 APIs. And so I think cloud services oftentimes have what I call the Spider-Man problem, which is, you can have a cloud service that gives you incredible power. You can use it in incredible ways and really build amazing applications with it. But it also comes with a great responsibility. And that responsibility can impact the security of your application and your company. And the sort of poster child for this is Amazon S3, which is arguably one of the best cloud services ever. The one time it's gone down in the last 15 years, I think, almost, it took like pretty much everybody down with it. And yeah, people were angry, but it's also amazing how often it's up, which is all the freaking time. But the thing about S3 is it's both secure storage and a web server, which is like just amazing and wrong, and like it's just really cool. But it's a configuration that you have to get right, and a lot of people get it wrong. Corey Quinn's last week in AWS newsletter, he talks about bucket negligence awards pretty much every week, and so this is a service where there's just a lot of power there. So, when we talk about some of the options that you have at the cloud layer, they're really sort of 2 pieces of it. There's the build time CI/CD side of this, where you can use something like, if you're using infrastructure as code, like CloudFormation or Terraform. There are tools that enable you to check those templates and make sure that your permissions are set correctly and all those sorts of things. And Eugene, maybe just a titch on, like, when you think about watching people come into the cloud for the first time, or even experts, like, how do people get this right?
Like in terms of like kind of making sure that their build time and runtime, well, like I think in any CI/CD pipeline, it's a process. You're not going to have a perfect CI/CD pipeline where you have like these different checks along the way, so that when you are pushing out like production code, that that it's going to be safe. It's not going to impact your infrastructure in a negative way. And so a lot of customers that I see going into like the cloud for the first time, one of the biggest thing is they don't really know what they don't know.
Yeah.
And that's the I think that's the entire premise of kind of security and like DevOps. And I think one thing that I've learned about Lacework that's pretty cool is that it kind of helps you figure out like what are things that you that you may not know, that you may not have written a rule for, but that they also kind of catch for you. So yeah, that's kind of like one of the biggest things that I've seen, is that like you don't really know where to kind of like begin, and also it's like a process to kind of create like a secure way of deploying your application.
Yeah. So one thing I want to be super clear about, because we got a question about this. So Lacework doesn't actually do that that cloud formation checking or Terraform checking today. AWS Config can help you do some of that. There's some other tools out there that that help you avoid those misconfigurations. The one place where we do help on the configuration side is once you're live, we can check your configurations. We can alert you to configurations that are dangerous or don't match the environment or the compliance needs that you have. But certainly, that ability to both build things well, but then understand what the reality is and continually improve is absolutely something that that we'll spend even more time talking about today. So on that front, let's talk just a little bit about about hosting container vulnerability. So this is another place where I think there's some very cool ways of scanning your host image before you deploy it. There are a number of different ways to scan your container registry or assess your containers in various ways before they're deployed, and then understand what's happening once they're actually live. And so, in Lacework's case, this is a place where we have a very cool capability on the host and the container side, and we allow an architect or developer to submit their AMI to our API, and we'll scan the packages and tell you what sort of vulnerabilities are in there. And there's a great demonstration of that capability and building that into Amazon Code Pipeline that Eugene did yesterday on Twitch. So if you want to go check that out, you can go see a couple of people fighting with CI/CD like for an hour or so. But that's just very awesome educational time. But there are always new vulnerabilities that show up, and so being able to surface those and understand that telemetry in a modern way, the way that we go about that is basically allow you to filter and sort on all the context that's relevant. So, for example, if you have an active package that has a fixable CVE, we can give you the telemetry to go sort and find that and really focus on the AMIs that you need, as opposed to all the hosts that may have been scaling up and down. So let's assume we've gotten our services fairly well configured. Maybe we start to get our arms around the vulnerabilities. Let's move to actually detecting breaches and threats and weird behaviors in the wild. And I think one of the key things that for this, especially at the cloud layer, is what are the data sources that you need? And the biggest data source for understanding changes that are occurring inside your cloud at the cloud layer is CloudTrail. And so, Eugene, why don't you take us through CloudTrail?
Yeah.
Tell us about CloudTrail.
So, I mean, kind of the AWS spiel about this is CloudTrail is our service that kind of helps you govern and make sure you're in compliance with any auditing, make sure that operationally you are auditing your risk and all things like that. And so the core feature of CloudTrail is that it captures every single API call that happens in your infrastructure. So at that cloud layer. So if you are creating like an EC2 instance, or like it's auto scaling and is creating more EC2 instances, you'll see kind of all that happening. And so that's the first part, which is cloud capture. And so the second part, it's storage. And so you can retain like these event logs into an S3 bucket. You can also send it to like Lacework or any other like third-party like services. And so from once you have it stored, you can start. There's another facet where like, okay, well, now that we're logging things, right? What's kind of like the actual practical use? We want to be able to know when certain things happen. So for example, in combination with CloudWatch and CloudTrail, you can actually like monitor like your S3 buckets to determine like whether it opens, and you can create a CloudWatch alarm that will send something to like your simple notification service to SNS to tell you, hey, like your private bucket that you want to keep private is now public. So you can kind of start reactively, like, making sure that nothing bad is happening in your infrastructure. And then overall, you have this, so now that you have like such a vast volume of data in your like S3 book or wherever, you want to be able to kind of analyze that. And so I'll talk a little bit more about like Amazon Athena and CloudWatch like logs, but that's kind of like the fourth facet, right? Like what I was just kind of referring to earlier, where you don't know, like a lot of customers that kind of go into the call, you don't know what you don't know. I think it really kind of pertains to CloudTrail, where that you have a huge sum of information, but if you don't know really like where to look for, you're just really just paying for storing these logs somewhere. So, and that, you can go to the next slide.
We can. Hold on one second. There we go.
Yeah, and so essentially kind of boiling down to what I was just saying earlier, CloudTrail helps you answer the question, and actually in Abner's earlier like slide, it's essentially answers the questions to like, who made the API call, when was the API call made, what was the API call, so like what was actually like happening, like which resources were affected by the API call, and like, where was the API call like you made from and made to. And you can go on to the next slide. And so within a CloudTrail log itself, there's a couple key references that I personally believe that is extremely important, and I'll kind of go through why. So event name, so what was the actual event that happened? And event source, like, what service actually performed the action. So like if you're making like an EC2 instance, like start storing data into like S3 or like DynamoDB, that's kind of what I'm referring to. And user identity, that's kind of like, who was involved, like, is it a role that did this, is it a user, things like that. And the user agent itself, which is again identifying the who, and so like it kind of tells you like, which application or OS or vendor or whatever of the requester itself. AWS region, which is like, defining where the activity was actually happening. And the source IP address, again, this kind of talks about like who and like where the customers are coming, the user is coming from, performing the action, and timestamp, which is like the when. And so next slide. And so essentially, just kind of like boil everything down again, like CloudTrail is a way to kind of just simplify how you're recording your infrastructure, or activities going on in your infrastructure. Kind of like what Abner was saying in the very beginning, there are certain compliance standards that needs to be met. So if you're going through like FedRAMP, SOC 2, or anything like that, there has to be evidence of activities going on in your environment. Otherwise, there has to be some level of responsibility happening between like, the company that is hosting their product on AWS and AWS itself. And of course, because of the wealth of information, CloudTrail can help you troubleshoot any issues that are happening in your account. And so what I kind of want to say about that is, so the story I was telling you all earlier about the ECS, like the production ECS cluster being deleted and all the services that were being hosted in that cluster, I believe, at least I think so. So what happened, what we found out was a vendor, someone that wasn't even part of the company, and this was a security risk on our part, but we gave them admin privileges, or at least the ability to delete things in production. And he accidentally deleted that production cluster. So we found out kind of like the root cause of like why that happened. And again, finding out the root cause of why something happened is the first step to kind of making sure that it won't happen again, right? Like you're understanding more of that security posture. And so, yeah, so that kind of like leads to the fourth point, which is like building security automation by tracking and responding to threats. Once you know what the threats are, you can kind of like start tackling that issue faster. And next slide.
Cool.
So we'll talk a little bit about some of the features in CloudTrail. Next slide after that. So we have like the audit trails that I was talking about earlier. So one that you actually have to configure recording these audit trails in your account. And so my recommendation is to always do this for all regions. You can do it for particular regions, but it kind of goes hand in hand that if you want to have full visibility into your infrastructure, it also includes the regions that where you're not deploying your applications to. And so that's why I recommend enabling CloudTrail for all regions. And you also want to be able to kind of like centralize like your logging somewhere. Having a disparate source of like all your logging information is one, going to make it very hard for you to investigate, for you to kind of query, for you to analyze like this data. But sorry, and so kind of like moving on that, like event delivery, there's a couple things in CloudTrail that's really cool too. There's a thing called event history in the CloudTrail API in the CloudTrail console. You can access it via the console or the API, and it will house the previous 90 days worth of CloudTrail information. And so you can kind of like write queries to look at like, hey, what was the most common API calls that were being made? Can you like a query like who deleted like a certain EC2 instance, or like deleted like anything within like the past 90 days and things like that. And also kind of like on the search and analytics side, you can actually leverage integration with CloudWatch logs as well as Amazon Athena. And so with both, so for Amazon Athena, you're going to store your CloudTrail logs into S3, and you are going to use Athena to kind of build out like, query events, and to kind of like, do the same thing that I was like mentioning earlier, where like if you want to find out like who did what, or whatever, whatever type of query you want to make, there's that kind of feature as well. And so, and lastly, you can always like send off your CloudTrail logs to like Elasticsearch service or any other kind of like solutions for like, deeper analysis. And so one thing about Audit Trails is that there's two types of data events. There's management events and data events. So management events is your typical like, I created like a S3 bucket and or I create like a DynamoDB. A data event is, all right, well now there's data being pushed into these services. So like data events will answer the question of like, what's being done to a particular service in terms of like data ingestion or anything related with data movement. And so these trails, like I mentioned earlier, you have to actually create them. And so you can either create it to be multi-account, and you can create it to be multi-region, or you could create it to be single account and single region. And and so there is a limit of 5 trails that you can make per region. And so you could create additional regions as needed for whatever purpose that you want for, such as operation support or security needs.
Cool.
And so, sorry, I'm a little bit repeating myself here, but again, you could deliver these logs like S3 or CloudWatch, and you could also, or you could even look at the event history section of the CloudTrail console as well. Sorry, we're just gonna scroll through this.
Let's maybe we talk about
kind of just putting it all together.
yeah.
Yeah. So at the end of the day, these are some of the kind of use cases that is the reason why you want to have CloudTrail enabled. You want to be able to identify when, like, which users are kind of like logged in during an incident. So for example, in the case I gave you, we know that, this user with this like username, or with this username in our AWS environment was the one that deleted the production ECS cluster. And we know that when he did it, like, when he did it and things like that. And you also want to know when admin privileges are granted. And so in that case, like, we know that he was granted admin privileges because of CloudTrail logs. And we know not to do that again in the future. And so, and kind of like moving past that, right? Like identifying like, when a file or an object has, their access requirements like changed, kind of like what Admin was talking about in terms of like configurations. These are all information that you will know because we're recording it. So again, these are kind of like the different use cases that CloudTrail is kind of being used for.
So should we maybe skip to like, what do people actually do with CloudTrail logs today?
Yeah, so I've been talking a lot about like how CloudTrail can like help enable you, but one thing, and coming from like a developer background, is like it sounds great in theory. It sounds great, like CloudTrail sounds great to like C-suite people, right? Like, oh man, like we now have a we have a way to kind of audit and do all these things like within our environment. But then when you're the actual like DevOps person or the IT person or security person, how does this all kind of like work? And so if you are a smaller company with not that many users and not that many services being used, CloudTrail like natively with some of the like native integration that has other AWS services might be enough to kind of grant you what you like to kind of to increase your security posture. However, as you scale and you become an enterprise, you have hundreds of developers like going into your AWS infrastructure. You're going to have thousands, tens thousands, hundred thousands of API calls to kind of sift through. And so that kind of becomes the issue of like scale, where how do you manage and prevent like your security staff from being overloaded with all these CloudTrail logs. And so I kind of want to just put it back to you, Abner, and we can kind of talk a little bit about how this can help.
I think one of the things that I hear all the time is people know that they need to keep their CloudTrail logs. So they'll store it in S3. And then, at small scale, it's like you said, you can go figure out what happened. It's pretty easy to figure it out. And especially like if your team isn't that big, then you can, Slack somebody and say, like, hey, was this you? Or, or people just, you kind of know what people are doing. But when the team gets really large, like nobody knows what anyone's doing anymore. And, they might, you can have teams where, they're working in different countries and you don't even know what their jobs are, or what it is that they're working on. And so very often, like the first way that if there is a problem, it's not the team that's responsible for the security of the environment. It's finance that finds the problem, right? Finance has a question where they say, hey, what's this on our bill? It looks like there's somebody's using a service somewhere that's kind of weird. And how do I, then can you look into this? At which point, then there's a fairly long mean time to WTF of trying to figure out, okay, when did that start? Do I even understand the Amazon bill to begin with? And then, is there like a good explanation for that or not? And then generally the way that most people do this today is they'll feed CloudTrail into a SIM, and they'll write a bunch of rules around that to look for, I would say, like things, and so those known bad things are codified in static rules. Very often it's account by account, and it's a sort of generalized rule of what I'm looking for. And there's a lot of maintenance that goes into that in order to do it well. It can take 20 to 45 minutes to write a rule and then tune that rule and then come back and suppress those alerts because Eugene's working on a project and he's generating a whole bunch of alerts, or somebody went on vacation to some weird country, but they're working there, or everybody went from working in the office to working at home. We saw a bunch of customers that had a big explosion in IP source alerting, and then lastly, the more you cloud, the more money you're going to spend on ingest into that SIM. And so that's what most people do today, and it's pretty reactive. The lacework approach, and we'll talk a little bit about how this actually gets done, is we have some known bad rules because there's some things that you always want to look out for, but you also get the unknown unknowns. So when we understand anomalies in the system, we surface those, and those anomalies could be as they could be a nefarious thing, or it could be something fairly simple, like the Belgian team just spun up a new service because they're working on a new app. And great, that's good to know. And so but I think the thing to really think about is, depending on your size and scale, what's the right approach for you to take in terms of understanding the changes that are occurring in your cloud.
And
Uh,
one thing,
yeah,
and sorry, yeah, and one thing I
yeah,
kind of like to add to that is you kind of mentioned like, like a high, like you're kind of starting to suppress like alerts if they're not, like if they're not actually things that are like actionable, kind of like what you were saying with like the Belgian team. Like, in my experience, there's there was like a huge push on my last team to kind of like, make sure that our learning system was great, that, we have a lot of these scenarios like tested out for. But kind of the issue becomes like, we wrote so many different rules. We set so many different thresholds. And we even set like, we even started classifying like, which are like, good, like, high priority events or like low priority events. But again, that's kind of static and your application changes over time, right? And so are you going to remember every single rule that you're going to write? Well, in my last team's case, that wasn't the case. Like we originally had like the alert sending to our Slack channel, our team Slack channel. And then after like a month, there were just too many alerts happening. And so we're like, hey, let's just store all these alerts into a separate Slack channel. But then that kind of defeats the purpose of like, notifying us to actually like do something about it. And so I remember when we actually like, set up that Slack channel, one of my teammates was just kind of like, well, what's the purpose of us like spending like a week writing up all these rules if we're not going to look at them? And that was a great question.
right,
There was not a
right,
good answer for it.
right. What? Now that we have them in the Slack channel, we know that we're not even going to go there
Yeah.
anymore. Right? Yeah. And that's, that context is varied because, you think about, maybe somebody does something that's well-intentioned, but not, kosher and, compliant, or, just sort of lazy, or, they're just not paying attention. How long does it take to catch that? That you lose a learning experience there. You lose an experience, an ability to turn to that team and say, hey, you've created something that's kind of risky. So we'll talk a little bit more about that investigation in a second. The way that the reason why Lacework is able to understand this is that machines can now build context for you. Well, if I can get to the next slide, we can actually look at what that looks like. So so if you think about the activity that occurs, that's kind of buried in those CloudTrail logs, it's that you have, somebody's working in a cloud account, they're working from a particular place, in this case, Portland, Oregon. They, make a call to a role. In this case, that's a Hydra configuration in US West 2 to SDS and EC2. They assume a role, and then there's some more configuration that occurs there. And so, just this alone, like a human can get your head around this. But when I put this into, what happens at scale, that same event is still in there, but it's really hard to figure out what's actually happening in the grand scheme of things. And so the cool thing about modern cloud is that machines can now do this work for us. And that's fundamentally what Lacework does. We graph all of this data so that the context becomes something that the machine can see, and then we can deliver to you the things that you need to go see, or you can go navigate the polygraph in order to understand something else that happened if you want to be able to do that. So so we've talked a bit about investigating, and I think we, I love, Eugene, your story around, what does that really look like? What does it look like to investigate something, and what does it feel like? I think is actually the other important bit. And so, when you look at, what do you want in that why, who, what, when, and where? That's because we have that context. Lacework can show you that inside an alert. And while this one is static, I think maybe we'll just hold on one second, and let me have my kids. Hey, Oscar, can you shut the door?
Just a quick
We're all
life
doing-
break. Quick
Yeah,
life.
all good. All good. Let's see. Let's bring this up.
So like the screen that Abner was just showing about how Elixir kind of shows like the different like logs that are happening in like your system. It's a lot nicer UI to look at than text files sometimes. So I just wanted to say that.
Yeah, totally. Okay, so so this is that Hydra example that we were talking about. This is the alert that would have been generated from that. And so we can see here, you know, one of the big questions that you always have is like, why did I get this alert, right? And sometimes you get an alert because Eugene wrote a rule 6 months ago that he forgot about, and
Happens.
And just figuring that part out is hard. And so, you know, here we see in this case the application Hydra was running on this host. As a user, they connected the application using SSH and on this other host. And so we can, if we wanted to, we could click into either of these and sort of see what else happened in those hosts. But let's keep going down. So, you know, what we see here is we have this user again on these two hosts. We have this application that has been, you know, looks like there's some more activity here. So we probably want to go check out what else this application has been up to. And, you know, we can see all the processes of all the different places that this particular application has been reaching out. Because we happen to know that Hydra is a tool that's often used for nefarious purposes. That's a pretty big flag in our case, but this could be any application. We had one customer who had a developer deploy a HipChat server in their environment. And like, I didn't even know that HipChat was still a thing, but maybe it was a couple of years ago before Slack killed HipChat. Like, you know, but whatever it is, you can go dig into this and see exactly what happened inside this file. And Eugene, if there's anything that you want me to click on, I'm happy to do that as well. We'll just, and I think the other thing that's kind of interesting is like, I couldn't write a Splunk query to save my life, but I can kind of dig around in this and go, oh, new privilege escalation. That doesn't sound like a good thing. Let's go take a look at that. And okay, this user changed their privilege on root. And you know, now they have this, oh, there's this new user. So you had a user that created a new user. That doesn't sound good. And I can go back and look at all the things that happened all the way through. I can see here that Luke Skywalker. We need to go find Luke Skywalker in our environment and figure out who that is. And you know, is this the ventilation port that he's going after? So you know, just in this alert alone, we've got all the information that you would need just to figure out, is this something that you should spend a fair amount of time with? You can see here, this is the actual.
Yeah, I think like the coolest part about, oh, sorry, Abner.
Yep, no, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think like the coolest thing, well, so there's a couple of points I want to make. I think, you know, both from like a security standpoint and just being like an engineer standpoint, I personally, and I know a bunch of my friends have never been asked kind of security question when you're interviewing for like, you know, for software developer roles. Security, even though we, you know, like AWS's like motto is security is number one, because if you can't trust us with your data, then like our platform, like, you know, AWS is kind of useless. And similarly, it's like, you know, if you're a company, like most companies, they want to keep security as their number one thing on their mind. But it's not really kind of a skill that they are necessarily looking after. And so you can hire, you know, security engineers that specializes in like DevOps and all things like that. But you kind of start wearing like a bunch of different hats. I think once you are like a software engineer, where you do app development, but then you also do kind of operational like monitoring, you do supporting, and then when you have like security events in your cloud infrastructure at the cloud layer, you sometimes like you're dead in the water because you're like, hey, I wasn't hired for this. Now we have to wait for our DevOps team to kind of help us out with this because I don't have permissions to look at these logs, right? Hey, they're following best security practices, but I'm kind of dead in the water. And then when you look at the DevOps team's SLA of being 11 days to 14 days, you're like, I'm going to get in trouble with my manager if I can't fix this issue, right? And so I think the idea of kind of democratizing like security is very, very important because you want as many people to understand like the security and health of your systems, so that one, you're not wasting money in case like something like, if someone is hacking into your system and, deploying like and installing like Hydra or, creating EC2 instances to like mine Bitcoin. You want to be able to be like first know, you want to be able to see that, you want anyone to be able to see that. But yeah, sorry, that just kind of
No,
something I want to point out.
I think it's super important because the ability for you to understand what's happening in your environment, to get better, to go from not knowing what's happening to being able to tell someone, oh, we know exactly what happened. This is a big deal. This is a little deal. It's not, or like, and I think that's one of the things that we see in some of the new behaviors of people who have this kind of information. It reminds me a lot of when people first got like New Relic or Datadog or App Dynamics, where you'd have these arguments around like, okay, what's wrong, right? And they go like, well, I never liked the database choice that other team made, so it must be that, right? As opposed to a data-driven conversation, which is, hey, the issue is the network, the piece of code that we just changed or whatever it is. And security is the same thing. You need to have those conversations on the team, and that might be, hey, there's a vulnerability in this package on this application that we care about. And that's a much stronger conversation than, hey, there's a, I think that here's 51,000 vulnerabilities you need to go fix, right? Like that's not a viable conversation.
Right.
Hey, there's a Slack channel that has 4,000 alerts in it. Like you might as well not have any.
And I mean, and like these alerts, like the amount of these alerts, depending on the size of your company, is just going to keep increasing. Like as more and more companies start moving over to like infrastructure as code, like, be it CloudFormation or Terraform, you're changing your infrastructure at the code layer, right? Like, someone could have accidentally might have deleted like a reference or like an inference like in your CloudFormation template, and then that just completely will take down everything. Well, one, you're always going to make sure that you're going to have some type of CloudFormation template checker or like some type of Terraform checker, obviously. But I think what I'm trying to say with that is like, as things are becoming more and more as like larger changes are happening from larger impact is happening from smaller changes. Having that increased security posture, understanding it very easily and responding faster, because a lot of companies.
I'll give you an example. So we have a customer. They have, and this happens like every day. Somebody logs in, they do like a Terraform failover test, and they have a they hit 28,000 APIs in that one, like, just do that thing, which is amazing, right? Like the fact that you can operate at that scale and hit 28,000 APIs in a single login, like that's amazing. From a security perspective, if you think about it from a classic, how would you manage security? It's absolutely horrifying.
Right.
But it's happening, right? So you have to match your tools to that to that new reality.
Yeah, like, how do you differentiate yourself as a company with your product if you're in a similar, like if you're like a lot of similar competitors is like the different features that you deploy, right? And the only way you deploy that is, and like the changes that you want to be able to make, you want to be as agile as possible. You want to keep, you want to, you want to have like a complete CI/CD pipeline. And when you're now messing with infrastructure as part of that CI/CD pipeline, there needs to be kind of like what you were saying earlier, right? Where there needs to be checks at like build time, making sure that like, before we even deploy any of this, these changes, like we need to make sure that it's not going to completely destroy our infrastructure. But then also at runtime where, hey, these are the rules that we know and we don't know. Sorry, here's the rule that we do know, and so we can kind of check that at runtime. But then the scary thing, right, is like any engineer's like worst fear is pushing out code, and then like 2 weeks later you get like a report from the finance team like, hey, so we see that there's like an increase of like $50,000 per week for like the region that your team is deploying to. Like, what's going on? You're like, uh-oh, like I messed up, right? And so you want to be able to kind of have that peace of mind as you're deploying things as rapidly as everyone else is. So
Yeah, and one kind of example I use of that is, if you think about cars, you spend a lot of time designing safety in cars, airbags, the seat belts and crumple zones, all that sort of stuff, and that's important. You have to do that design in the build time. But just because you do that design doesn't mean you want to like get rid of 911 and ambulances and sort of emergency services, right? You still want things still happen, and you still need to understand what's happening in the real world once the system is up and running. So the last thing that I had was just sharing some of the lacework behaviors, but we've already talked about that in terms of kind of what it means to get continuous improvement. One of the things that's cool about lacework alerts is because we have all of the context. Not only is your time to investigate very, very short, but you get fewer alerts. And so because the volume is smaller and richer, you can do things like put the alert into a Slack channel and have the team discuss, oh, what is this? Is this something that we did that we need to go investigate or change because we did something wrong? Or is it something that's more nefarious and an early indicator of a breach? And so that conversation is pretty cool, and it's really neat to see that cultural change that's driven from that. We talked about the infrastructure as code and people driving lots and lots of changes. And then the last bit that I think is interesting from a security perspective is that the way that people justify security investments is also changing. So it used to be, we're going to spend on various security investments because we have to, because maybe a bad thing will happen. And certainly, security as insurance is absolutely a thing. But the other thing that we're starting to see is companies where they say, hey, we want to go sell to larger customers. We want to go create a application that has higher value data in it, and we need to know what's happening in that in order to earn the trust of our customers. And so the justification is shifting from, hey, this is a tax that we have to pay, to this is a capability that we need in order to go sell to larger customers, replicate our environments internationally, modernize our infrastructure onto containers. Those are the types of justifications that we see that I think are really interesting. This has been great fun. I think we're at the top of time. Eugene, anything else that you want to leave people with or mention before we drop?
Trying to think of I think
And
again,
if you have questions, feel free to drop those in. There have been a couple of questions. I think we answered them.
yeah, I think like the last couple thing, or like just like the last thing is as as we are going in, like, you know, as technology companies like keep increase, like the amount keep increasing, and like the level of sophistication of like security and like cyber attacks are also increasing. um, Security is probably going, like, you know, how to reduce your investigation time, how to make sure that you don't have catastrophic like security events is like, you don't want to be like on like the Wall Street Journal, or I don't know if that was the right newsletter, or like the Washington Post or like the New York Times saying like, oh, like, you know, unicorn like startup suffered like a catastrophic like security event where 14 million of their users data was like, you know, taken. These things aren't like, they don't happen just because they don't happen like out of random. I guarantee you that, like, you know, secure like hackers, security like experts, like they will probe into your environment, and if you can't recognize these probes, you can't recognize like the smaller security issues, you're never going to be able to prevent the larger catastrophic ones. So
I couldn't agree more. And Eugene, thank you so much for sharing your stories, for educating us on CloudTrail. I always learn something every time I talk to you, and thank you so much.
yeah, no, thanks for having me.
Awesome. Thank you, Amy.
All
All
right, thanks
right,
everyone.
And thank you everyone who joined today.
hope you all have a good rest of your day.